Today we're looking at Henry VIII and why Wolsey fell from power. From 1527, Henry had been trying to gain an annulment from Catherine of Aragon in order to marry Anne Boleyn. This had been for a number of reasons, most importantly, Catherine's inability to provide Henry with a male heir. Despite many pregnancies, including the live birth of a couple of sons, they only had one living daughter, Mary, and Catherine was no longer able to fall pregnant. This led Henry to believe that God was displeased with the marriage, as she had been his brother's wife. As a result, Henry tried to argue that, contrary to Catherine's claims, she had in fact consummated her marriage to Arthur. It was at this time that Henry had fallen for the younger, vivacious and cultured Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. Believing that marriage to Anne would enable him to have a son to succeed him, Henry was desperate to gain his annulment. As Cardinal from 1515 and Papal Legate from 1518, Wolsey and Henry had been convinced that he would be able to gain the annulment. This had led to Henry placing all his hopes in his chief minister. However, with Catherine's determination to remain Henry's lawful wife and unwilling to accept that they had never legally been married, along with her strong support base, the case proved to be too difficult for Wolsey to achieve. Wolsey's cause was further hampered by the fact that in 1527 Charles V sacked Rome and captured the Pope, leading to the Pope and then Campeggio failing to grant the annulment. As a result, Henry lost all hope, and after this, Wolsey's fall from power came quickly. Once Wolsey was blamed by Henry for the failure to gain the annulment, hardly anyone supported him. Some of this can be explained by his background and his personality, and how he appeared to enjoy monopolising power at others' expense, causing the jealousy of other nobles. Many saw him as being arrogant and treating others as his inferiors. Even dukes who were related to the king by blood were treated as inferior by Thomas Wolsey when he was at the apogee of his power. This meant that as soon as his power base seemed to be weakening, there were many who were happy to take this opportunity to help cause the fall of the chief minister. Wolsey also enjoyed showing off his immense amount of wealth. One description by George Cavendish, one of his servants, recounted how Wolsey travelled with 2 great crosses of silver carried before him, with his sergeant at arms carrying a silver mace, and with his ushers shouting out, "My lords and masters, make way for the Lord's grace." Some believed that Wolsey was so rich, with his home at Hampton Court and a household numbering 500 servants, that he was almost as wealthy as the king. This, along with his power, led to some referring to him as the Alter Rex. It was expected that kings and nobles showed their wealth off to others at this time. However, what particularly annoyed many nobles was that Wolsey was not a noble like them. He had been born the son of a butcher, and as a lowborn, many believed he shouldn't have more wealth and power than those born with royal blood, such as the Duke of Norfolk. Wolsey's lack of humility and his determination to show off his wealth to other nobles didn't help him to ingratiate himself with them. This rise to power for someone of such a low birth was incredibly unusual, as it was expected that kings should take advice from nobles. As a result of his low birth and his somewhat arrogant manner, nobles such as Norfolk and Suffolk really resented Wolsey, especially as they felt that Henry had pushed them aside. Whilst Wolsey was high up in the king's favour, they had been able to do little about their dislike, biding their time in the hope that at some point they might be able to cause the fall of Cardinal Wolsey. Wolsey's actions as minister had also caused hostility from the nobility. One example was Wolsey's stance on enclosure, whereby Wolsey, through Parliament, had attempted to stop enclosure, which was the closing off of common lands by the nobles and gentry. This, if successful, would have impacted on landowners and the wealthy, particularly the nobles. Many nobles also disliked Wolsey's justice reforms, which encouraged the poor to gain justice against the rich. Wolsey had helped the poor to bring lawsuits against the rich to find justice. He had also brought in the policy that judges had to provide reasons for their verdicts rather than just providing a verdict. This made judgments more transparent and meant there was less opportunity for bribery and corruption by the nobility. As a result, more members of the nobility found themselves being punished, and for this they blamed Cardinal Wolsey. Nobles also disliked the subsidy that Wolsey had brought in. As a result of this 1523 change in taxation, whereby there was a reassessment of property value, nobles had to pay more in taxes. Despite disliking Wolsey and his policies, Wolsey had enjoyed the king's favour, which had kept noble hostility largely at bay. That was until he failed in the greatest challenge he had been given by Henry. Wolsey's failure to achieve the annulment changed that situation. He had become vulnerable to his enemies, who could blacken his reputation with the king. In the summer of 1529, Henry was given a book containing over 30 accusations against Wolsey. At the head of the accusers were the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, the two most powerful noblemen in the country. Wolsey's downfall was largely caused by the influence of the Boleyn faction. A faction was a group of nobles who worked together to influence the king, or who competed with other factions to influence the king and increase their own power. The Boleyn faction used the opportunity of the failed annulment to turn Henry against his chief adviser. Now it had developed around Anne in the late 1520s. The key members of the faction were her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, made Earl of Wiltshire in 1529, her brother George Boleyn, knighted and made Viscount Rochford in 1529, and her uncle Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, who believed that he and not Wolsey should be the chief adviser to King Henry VIII. For much of Wolsey's time as Chief Minister, he had been able to avoid being affected by attacks from factions by dedicating time and energy into ensuring that his enemies had little power with the king. For example, the Eltham Ordinances highlighted one way in which Wolsey sought to prevent rivals from gaining close access to the king. Up until 1527 he was largely successful, except for the failure of the 1525 Amicable Grant. This grant, which had been introduced to help pay for an invasion of France to take advantage of the capture of Francis I by Charles V at the Battle of Pavia, had led to an uprising, with many refusing to pay this tax so soon after the subsidy. Henry had blamed the failure of the tax on Wolsey, even forcing him to publicly apologise. This tax had alienated many, including the nobles and Parliament, as they felt that Wolsey had tried limiting their power and role by not getting the tax passed by Parliament. Failure to have Parliament approve the tax was a crucial reason for people rebelling, as they felt it was not legal. This tax was arguably a long-term factor which contributed to the fall of Wolsey. It must be noted that after this, Wolsey served Henry faithfully, and it had been Wolsey to whom Henry had entrusted his great matter. So arguably, if Wolsey hadn't failed to gain the annulment, on its own the Amicable Grant wouldn't have been enough to bring Wolsey's downfall, as it happened 4 years before he finally fell from favour. As Henry fell more in love with Anne and she became increasingly powerful at court, a result was that a powerful group of nobles developed around her, sensing an opportunity to promote their own interests through her. Wolsey was unable to prevent this from happening due to the intensity of Henry's feelings for Anne. As Cardinal Campeggio noted, Henry's love for Anne was something amazing, and in fact he sees nothing and thinks nothing but Anne. He cannot stay away from her for an hour. Henry's love meant that Anne was now the person with by far the greatest influence on Henry, and Henry seemed to be a person who was easily swayed. When Wolsey was unable to secure the annulment, the Boleyns, alongside Anne, argued that Wolsey was deliberately trying to disrupt the divorce proceedings. They said that Wolsey favoured Catherine and believed the king would tire of Anne, which was leading to him stalling. This was not the case, but Henry was easily swayed by rumours. As each effort by Wolsey and Henry failed, so their attacks on the chief minister increased, and Anne in particular grew to hate Cardinal Wolsey. Sensing their opportunity, many other nobles with grudges against Wolsey eagerly sided with Anne and Norfolk. With the final failure of the annulment proceedings at Blackfriars in the summer of 1529, when Campeggio failed to rule in Henry's favour, instead referring the case back to Rome, the Boleyns helped to persuade Henry that Wolsey had to go. Anne's influence over Henry was probably crucial in the first stage of Wolsey's fall in October 1529. This was when Wolsey was dismissed as Chancellor and ceased to be the King's chief minister. Norfolk and Suffolk replaced him as Henry's chief counsellors. Despite this turn of events, even at this point, things were not over for Wolsey. In fact, Wolsey still hoped to return to power, and for several months Wolsey's fate hung in the balance. At times, it even appeared that Henry might recall Wolsey. This scared the Boleyns, who were worried that if he did return to power, he might try to take his revenge on them. Therefore they, and particularly Anne, continued to tell Henry that Wolsey should be put on trial, perhaps for treason. Everything depended on how Henry felt for Wolsey. The Boleyn faction in this matter were helped by the fact that Wolsey had been removed from court, eventually being sent north. This meant that Wolsey didn't have personal access to the king to plead his case. Despite the attempts by the Boleyns to bring about the fall of Wolsey, it must be noted that at this time it was the monarch alone who took all major decisions, such as the removal or the execution of a minister. No one else could make these decisions for him. Even if they tried to influence the king, it was still ultimately his choice. Henry wasn't good at making major decisions, often hesitating and failing to make up his mind. Henry's behaviour to Wolsey is a good example of his indecisiveness. Even though in the autumn of 1529 Henry dismissed Wolsey from his role as Archbishop of York and took his palaces of Winchester and St Albans, Wolsey also received a jewelled ring and a note from Henry telling him to be of good cheer. To Wolsey this must have implied that he would return as chief minister. Henry even said once that in managing business Wolsey was a better man than any of them, meaning his new advisers. This must have greatly alarmed the Boleyn faction. At this point, Norfolk and Suffolk were taking on a greater role in advising the king. In February 1530, Wolsey even received a royal pardon and took up his duties as Archbishop of York again, which gave him hope. However, Henry's indecisiveness continued, so that in April 1530, in a U-turn, Wolsey was ordered to move to York, away from London and court. This was when Wolsey in desperation wrote to Francis, the Pope, Catherine of Aragon and even Charles V, who you can see in the picture, trying to bring about a deal which might restore Henry's faith in him. In the end, Wolsey's enemies found enough evidence to push Henry into making the decision that they wanted. They reported to Henry that Wolsey had been writing letters to the Emperor Charles, to the King of France and to the Pope, supposedly to win their support for ending the relationship between Henry and Anne. The King of France also said that he had received letters from Wolsey supporting their claims. Wolsey, still getting involved in foreign policy, especially if he was planning to end Henry's relationship with Anne, would have greatly annoyed Henry. It was this evidence, which was presented to Henry, which ultimately led to his downfall. Wolsey was charged with praemunire, which was serving a foreign power, in this case the Pope, instead of the King. At this point, his greatest office, the chancellorship, was taken from him and given to Thomas More. We do not know if Wolsey really wrote these letters, but the evidence given to Henry was enough to convince him that Wolsey had betrayed him by writing to other foreign leaders behind his back. To Henry, it seemed as though Wolsey had put his loyalty to the Pope and the Queen before his loyalty to Henry, and Henry hated nothing more than disloyalty. These charges led directly to Henry ordering Wolsey's arrest and trial for treason. Wolsey now lost all hope of returning to power, saying, "I see how the matter against me is framed. But if I had served my God as diligently as I have done the King, he would not have given me over in my grey hairs." Ultimately, Wolsey cheated his enemies, who hoped to see him humiliated in a trial. By this point, his health was broken, and he died on his way south at Leicester. Thus he was spared the fate of almost certain execution. His last words expressed regret that he had served his king better than he had served God. Different historians have different interpretations as to why Wolsey fell from power. There is no right or wrong answer. But when we're looking at this, we should think about the fact that the failure to gain an annulment was clearly crucial in his fall. However, we also need to look at the importance of the Boleyn faction and how they played on this, along with Wolsey's personality, his lack of humility, his flouting of his wealth, his policies and his low-born background, which created the hostility with the Boleyn faction, who believed that he was too powerful. Lastly, we need to consider the fact that if Henry did find out about Wolsey's correspondence, it was ultimately this last act which finally sealed the nail in the coffin of Cardinal Wolsey. This is CL Barber 1977. Thank you for watching.